Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jamie. I'm the Director of Operations at Women and Children First Bookstore in Chicago. On a day in which women's bodily autonomy is once again threatened, I'm thrilled to have you all here to join me in welcoming Sonora Jha in conversation with Anca Szilágyi. And I'm sorry, my kid is trying to jump in, which I think is I think is appropriate to talk about Sonora's book, How to Raise a Feminist Son. We begin our virtual events as we begin our events in the store with a land acknowledgement. Please join me in taking a moment to acknowledge that the land on which the bookstore stands is the unceded territory of the Peoria, Potawatomi, and Miami people. We encourage you to learn more about land acknowledgements and about the rightful owners of the land where you are viewing tonight's event. Thank you. I'm happy to say that our bookstore is open for browsing, but we also still have curbside pickup and we ship anywhere in the US on our website. Our upcoming events will continue to be on Crowdcast as long as Delta is doing their thing. And we encourage you to check out our website for our event calendar and also for the tickets for our ticketed events with authors like Ana Castillo, Samira Ahmed, and we have an event that we just announced with Anita Hill. Some logistical Crowdcast information you might need to know during the event. If you have a question for either of our authors, you can use the Ask a Question box at the bottom of your screen, and you can utilize the chat bar on the right-hand side of your screen to talk to one another. You can also buy a copy of How to Raise a Feminist Son by clicking the Buy a Book box, which is also at the bottom. It's big on the bottom of the screen. With that housekeeping out of the way, let's turn our attention to our authors. Sonora Jha is an essayist, novelist, researcher, and professor of journalism at Seattle University. She's the author of the novel Foreign, and her op-eds and essays have appeared in the New York Times and the Seattle Times and in several anthologies. She is joined tonight in conversation by Anca Szilágyi, who is the author of the novel Daughters of the Air. Anca's writing appears in publications such as the Los Angeles Review of Books and Electric Literature, and her second novel is forthcoming in 2022. Sonora Jha's book, How to Raise a Feminist Son, spoke to me on a molecular level as the mother of an 8-year-old white boy myself. This book is a mix of memoir and guidebook with a handy to-do list at the end of each chapter. I recognize some of the things I already do with my kid and some that I could be better about. Since finishing, I've been handing it to everyone I know who has a young person of any gender or identity in their life. Thank you so much for writing this book for those of us who are working to raise a fiercely feminist generation of boys. So now I'll say thank you once again for joining us and hand off the virtual stage to Sonora and Anca.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you all for joining us tonight. It's a real pleasure to be here with Sonora to talk about How to Raise a Feminist Son. I've got my tabs. I really enjoyed reading it. Sonora and I know each other from Seattle, and she was the writer in residence at Hugo House, where we both teach, and we've had many writing dates together. And it's extra special to reconnect. This year, around this book, I became a mom to a son in January. And so there were a lot of things that I connected with. And so I'm really eager to talk to you, Sonora, about so many things, but I thought it would be nice for the audience to hear you read a bit from the book, perhaps the chapter on goddesses.
Thank you, Anca, and thank you, Jamie, for that lovely introduction and for telling us about your feeling around the book and your son. And Anca, I miss you so much here in Seattle. I'm not in Seattle right now. Yeah, I miss you. I miss our writing dates, and I'm so happy to connect this way and watching from afar on social media, watching you becoming a mom. It was just so satisfying and so exciting. I'm very, very excited for you because you're at the beginning of the journey and I'm sort of at the end of that. What I hope and think is the end, if there ever is an end to that journey. So I'm really happy to be here with you in this moment and in this capacity. And you mentioned that the mythology part of goddesses resonated with you. So I'm happy to read from that chapter. So this chapter is called "What Would the Goddesses Do?" And I sort of talk about how I drew upon, when I became the mother of a son, I sort of like was wondering, what do I do? How does one do this? And I hadn't realized how much of an impact some of Hindu mythology had on me. And I sort of drew upon those stories of goddesses in Hindu mythology and found that there were a lot of stories of goddesses raising sons, and in fact, not too many of them raising daughters, which troubled me. But for my purpose, I found those stories really helpful, and also had to repurpose some of them because there's also misogyny in any kind of mythology and tradition, and Hindu patriarchal traditions, and the retelling of stories. So I'm kind of telling and retelling some of these stories in this chapter. So I'll read from that. Hindu mythology was awash in stories of mothers raising sons, but had few tales of mothers raising daughters. When I held the baby Gibran in the crook of my elbow, guiding him to my milk-swollen breast, the goddess mothers came leaping and dancing over my imagination and placed a guiding hand on my shoulder. I hardly trusted my own poor mother to teach me how to raise a boy, because by age 27, I had seen enough of how she and my father had raised my brother. So I looked back at those mothers from the 4-rupee comic books in which I'd read the mythology. The 3 best-known stories of mothers raising boys told me that those boys had turned out okay, for the most part, for their time, for the misogyny of the moment and all. One of the greatest love stories in Hindu mythology is the one between Yashoda and her adopted son, Krishna. The baby's birth mother, Devaki, was in prison, thrown there by her brother, King Kamsa. Krishna was born in prison, smuggled out, and given to Yashoda to raise. The babies born to his mother before him had been bludgeoned to death, dashed on the prison floor. I challenge my generation of Indians to erase from their consciousness the comic book visual of baby head dashing on floor. Because King Kamsa had been told that he would be vanquished by one of these babies born to his sister. Violent uncle for Krishna, violent uncle role model for Gibran, my son. But we will get to that later. Yashoda, a woman from a lower caste, had no idea of the divine powers that the baby Krishna was born with. She was handed the smuggled baby to raise and got busy with the job of providing copious amounts of love. She nurtured the baby, sang love songs about this son, forgave him his butter-thieving ways, and as he grew into a young man, enabled his outrageous flirtations with every young maiden in the village. Some of the stories make these flirtations sound more like harassment, so I made a note to do better than Yashoda there. For all her enabling and privileging, Yashoda raised a feminist ally. How do we know Krishna was a feminist? When Queen Draupadi, from the Hindu epic the Mahabharata, was being sexually assaulted by her brothers-in-law after her 5 husbands wagered her in a chess match and lost, she damned all of those men in her life and called out to Krishna. The child Krishna had grown into an adult divine power by then, and he was sort of a part divine, part human advisor to this gambling, raping family. He showed up as an apparition and draped Draupadi in a never-ending sari. The rapist royals tugged and tugged at the miles of sari until they fell down, exhausted, unable to strip Draupadi naked. At another point of time in the history of the universe, and in another comic tossed to me when my brother was done, a princess named Rukmini was kidnapped and was being forced into marriage with a king at the wishes of her brother and father to advance their kingdom. Rukmini, who had never met Krishna but had long had a crush on him from the legends she had heard, sent for him through a talking bird. Krishna arrived. She proposed to him. He accepted. They eloped. May we all find men who, if we so choose, drape us in endless silk, or elope with us when we're in a bit of a spot. My son probably won't be called to exactly such levels of solidarity or divine intervention, and Krishna's own feminism must be scrutinized as a mere flicker of a torchlight in the dark millennia of patriarchal debauchery in Hindu mythology. But it's hard not to see Yashoda's love in Krishna's actions. Her adoption of Krishna in itself was an act of feminist solidarity. From Yashoda, I learned to love my boy unconditionally. Yashoda would tell us to love these things about our boys: their plump fists holding our hands to take their first steps, the way they bounce off the walls with a room full of other kids at a 4th birthday party, the way they hold their necks upright and their faces serious as they disappear under a barber's cape at their first little haircuts, the way they wind their arms around your neck and their legs around your torso because they are afraid in the river or the swimming pool, and Mama won't let them go, will she? The way they fall down and cry with all the thunder of the universe over a skinned knee. The way they blink in confusion the first time they are told, boys don't cry. The way they run up to dogs or run away from geese. The way they look at their hands when they put on their first ever baseball or cricket glove. The way they take up room in the world and say, like an unbludgeoned, full-headed Krishna, I'm here. Okay, not all of those notations come from Yashoda. Some of them are mine. And none of these things describes the worlds of boys alone. I want to lean into our love of boys in that space before they are really much different from a girl, a non-binary space. And I'm also hoping and praying for a world that lets our girls take up space in exactly the same way as our boys, because there's enough space for us all. And loving our boys now means teaching them how to move over and make room, make that safe and fulfilling space for our girls. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonora. Such a beautiful excerpt. And, you know, I'm a mother through adoption, so I was also drawn to that Yashoda story because of that connection. And the lesson about unconditional love reminding me, I'm by no means an expert on attachment parenting, but that's a thing that I've learned about through adoption is, you know, you hold your child close, and they develop the confidence that they need, and then they'll hop off your lap when they're ready with the confidence that they need. So I was thinking about that in terms of unconditional love, and later when you talk about raising boys of color, my son is brown. You know, praising your sons for their accomplishments. So all of that was kind of swirling around, and in talking about in our culture, swimming in the culture, you talked about at the beginning of that section in the book, you mentioned you weren't raised religiously, but Hindu mythology was all around, and it's true that, you know, we're swimming in the culture. So there are the things that you can do in your home, and then there are the things that are beyond the home, and you have to kind of be aware of both of those, all of those things. Where am I bumbling to? I wanted to get to in that section a little later on. You talk about the intensity of a mother's love and how it can have the potential to enable trespasses, right? So there are two sides of the coin, right? That you need to have the intensity of love and the unconditional love. But you also, in raising a feminist son, you're thinking about how do you love them in a way that they make that space that you were talking about at the end of that section. And as the mother of an almost 8-month-old, of course, you know, it's a very different interaction than with an 8-year-old or a 26-year-old. So I was wondering if we could talk maybe a little bit about, now I'm just going to get parenting tips from you, age-appropriate ways of showing your child those boundaries while, you know, also, of course, still having that unconditional love.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons it's so delightful to see you at the stage that you are at with your son is that I miss it. I miss that stage of unconditional love where that's just a baby to be enjoyed and held close, and and I have now my son is 26, and I don't get the hugs that I wanted. So there's that physical thing too, but I also get the pushback and the arguments and but also the delightful wondering about the world, and conversations and the debates, and exchanges and laughter and all of that. Yeah. So I think unconditional love, there's also a saying that I couldn't quite say in Sanskrit in India about how childhood for any child of any gender is just a time of unconditional love, and then it moves into learning, like as you grow older, then comes a lot of learning and discipline and those kinds of things. But I do think initially giving any child that sense of unconditional love and letting them wander in the world and giving them that security that there's always a home to return to is so important. And then I think, in the book I cite this research that this group of people led by Dr. Judy White Chu is doing on boys and their psychosocial behaviors, and that certain cues they start to get at the age of 4, and girls too, right? Like we find that girls get this sense of like beauty very early in their lives, and that they can tell, they can judge like who is more beautiful than the other, and start to get those kinds of things. And race and color and all of that starts to come in, right? So in this particular research, she found that the 4-year-olds that they were doing these studies with, their fathers would come to drop off their boys for the study, for their play study or observation, and then they would hug them and they would say, "Oh, I feel so sad for that this boy is soon going to lose this tenderness." Right? And so they asked them, like, why do you feel that they'll lose this tenderness? Well, because he'll become a boy. And it's almost like you feel as if it's something biological that's going to surface and that they will lose their tenderness, right? But that's not true. And so I think, it's the socialization. It's like when we say, right, boys don't cry. We tell them start telling them around the age of 4, I guess, right? Boys don't cry, and and so she also says that we're casting boyhood as non-girlish, right? The opposite of being feminine, because being feminine means being weak and blah, 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 all of that. So to me then, around that age, the unconditional love is in disrupting some of those cultural behaviors or the psychosocial development, sort of disrupting that and saying, no, being tender, being a boy means being tender. Being a boy means being able to cry. Being a boy means, what if we flip some of those things around and that we agreed as a society and widened that network of friends that say, we're not going to give these messages. And it's happening, right? So then there's that. And of course, then we need to start talking to them about sex and sexuality early enough. Again, when you compare it with girls, we start telling girls very early, don't stay out late at night, be careful of the length of your skirt, keep your knees to, sit this way, be careful of where someone's touching you. We're giving them all these things where what we're really talking about is sex and sexual assault. We don't think that we're doing that. We think we're telling them about dangers, right? And that their first introduction to the idea of sexuality is how they are in danger, right? But we're not telling boys, you could, don't be dangerous, don't be that kid, and be careful, So I think at every stage, there can be a loving examination, and that it's an act of love and compassion then to say to boys that you can be tender-hearted, you can be, you don't have to lose any of that, and you can also see what girls are going through and be and live to a more tender masculinity.
I love that the notion of tender masculinity comes up a lot in the book. Many examples of fathers who practice it with their sons, and seeing your son growing into it, and you mentioned, I think in a later chapter, the young boys just crying out to be raised right, to maintain that tenderness. I was thinking about that when I was teaching, reflecting on teaching 4th and 5th graders writing fairy tales back in, I think it was 2019, and then kind of seeing it in their eyes when, like, we would talk about the stories that they're writing. And it wasn't, there weren't issues of gender in the particular story, but there was something about capitalism in the story where the little boy thought he had to say that making money was like the goal. He had kind of this like sullen look in his eyes. And when I told him, like, well, it doesn't have to be that, it's just interesting to see how malleable they are, at 9, 10. But I wanted to go back to that as I continue to diverge back and forth. I wanted to go back to the chapter on goddesses. There was another story that, and it's related to all of this, of course. The story of Parvati, is that how you pronounce her, the goddess?
Parvati, yeah.
Parvati. She forms her son from turmeric and clay. And it reminded me of a short story by Leslie Arima, Who Will Greet You at Home. I don't know if you know that short story, but the premise is it's a world without men, but the pressure to have children is still very heavy. And women choose the materials in which they make their children. So it can be porcelain or mud or hair from the hair salon where you work. So there's a socioeconomic theme in the story. But I was thinking about this idea of how does one, form your child from what, the materials that are available to you. I think in that same section you talk about choosing the school for Gibran and making sure that he was surrounded by educators who were diverse and would expose him to the things you wanted to expose him to. So I thought you could maybe, if you would like to talk a little bit about that story or that issue.
Yeah, so the story of Parvati is that, she was married to the god Shiva, who is the destroyer. And that Shiva would leave for long periods of travel and she would get lonely. And so at one of his long intervals away, she decided that she was going to create this boy out of, this child out of clay and the cells from her own body and turmeric and this beautiful child, and she makes this beautiful boy. And when Shiva comes back, so she says, I'm going to go take a bath, and don't let anyone in to the home, right? And his father comes back, Shiva comes back, and he doesn't recognize the father, so he says, my mom's in the bath, like, too bad you can't come in. And Shiva, who doesn't know who this kid is, gets really enraged and cuts off his head. I mean, this grounds for leaving this man. But anyway, he's still leaving this god. But see, he cuts off the child's head, and then Parvati sees this and is screaming, and Shiva goes outside and gets an elephant head and puts that on the boy and says, okay, are we good now? And so, and that's how we got Ganesha, the elephant-headed god. And so, there is something to that, and and I say that from Parvati, I learned to have solidarity, from a boy, right? To expect solidarity, for him to respect the voice of women and the command of women, right? And about consent. He said, my mother said, you cannot walk in, right? And that matters, that kind of consent matters. So in a way, it sort of blends into your next question. We can use any of these tools, right? So in talking about the story of Parvati, I can talk about consent, right? And say, oh yeah, really what that was about was consent and the voice of women, and sort of standing in solidarity with a woman's will. And then, using different kinds of things, so even story, there's a whole chapter on books and stories and fairy tales and nursery rhymes that we repurpose those, right? And we bring humor and fun into it, right? And say, why is Mary, why is she being described as contrary? And why, the silver bells and cockle shells? No, she's using soil. And, I quote someone saying that she, with great soil maintenance techniques and everything, that's how she makes her garden grow. She knows how to do gardening, right? And no pretty maids and all in a row. So a lot of these, nursery rhymes, you can just really start having fun with them, have fun with fairy tales. There are great retellings, right? I'm so envious of you because those books were not necessarily around when I was raising my son. And then my first chapter is really about movies, right? That he went to the movies, and we still, like, when we every time we are in the same, when he visits home, we go to the movies. And there's so much misogyny and a lack of representation, and you look at the Bechdel test and everything, and we don't find women at the movies doing anything purposeful, and often they're used as, for the revenge trope, so the man can get revenge. Talking about all of those things just created this sort of like examination of culture, right? And the chit chat around that. And then, of course, there were all these other things too, like, why do you feel that you have to be a certain way? Like what you're talking about with the capitalism thing and the sullen boy saying it, that's just really the pressure on a boy to start imagining himself as protector and provider, right? And it's so heartbreaking because it's like, no, it's okay. You can also think of yourself as a stay-at-home dad, as a working from home father, and maybe your partner is more driven. If your partner is a woman and she's driven and she wants to work outside the home, so it's also like giving them a sense of that safety and security, that you don't have to rise to some occasion and be the guy who beats the guy up at the bar because he said something to your woman. Like what a horrifying thing, right? And it's possible. And the reason I say it's possible is because my son, he, in all these years, he didn't have an experience where there were fights on the playground and he got a busted lip. And we say, oh, boys will be boys. Of course, they're going to have fights in playgrounds. They didn't. And these kids, and he and his friends, they didn't have. So it can be done, right? And it's not like that aggression's gone somewhere else. Sure, of course we have like the campus shootings and all of that. That's a whole lot of other thing, right? About alienation and boyhood and all of that, and the pressures as well. But this thing where we expect that, no, they're definitely going to have fist fights, that's not necessarily true. So I think in staying in conversation, taking little bits of culture, taking little moments from here and there, the teachers, finding the right community, finding their feminist village, all of those things really add up and make for a child that feels a boy that feels more secure and also feels like he doesn't have to conform to something.
Yeah, I was thinking about also the story of Sita and her boys Lav and Kush. In that section, you talk about so the goddess Sita, she has twins, and in characterizing them, you say that there aren't that many stories of ideal manhood or just ordinary manhood. Stories of men who are not prone to rage, who are not power hungry. Lav and Kush are neither of those things. But I see that, in that chapter and in the following chapter where you talk about fairy tale retellings and, changing the stories, that we have that power to form our children in part through the stories we tell them. And so it's great to see that that mention of like those gaps in storytelling that we can fill, and we can start to tell those stories. And in the seg between I love how your each chapter in your book has like these prompts for reflection or things to do. At the end of that mythology chapter, before we get to the chapter on fairy tales, there's a prompt to think about a story of mothering or parenting that is prominent from your childhood, and then thinking about both the good and the bad, and what can you take from it, what would you change. And when I reflected on it, the thing that just popped up immediately was Hansel and Gretel, and just like those, for me, the fairy tales so often have these kind of like ineffectual parents, like they're not sure what to do. Oh, we'll send Hansel and Gretel out into the woods to fend for themselves. And in reflecting on like, okay, what are the lessons we can learn from that? Or, okay, well, I guess we're teaching children to be independent and resourceful, or, you know, but then they're tempted by the candy house and the cannibalistic witch, or, you know, then there are the, you know, all the lessons maybe we don't want about, you know, tropes about witches, but this idea of, you know, whether to let your child go out into the woods or staying close reminded me finally of the last topic I wanted to talk to you about was media literacy, and how in the chapter on this that in our day and age we are soaked in media, in social media especially, that there aren't really parental controls at this point, that really what you need to do is constantly engage, which I thought was something very helpful and something to think about. And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, you know, when I was a single mom, right? And that's the thing with Sita as well, like that she was, you know, cast away into the forest and raised these boys to the age of 14, and then their father comes along, you know, to get her back. But I remember telling the story to my son, and he said, "Oh, so Sita was a single mom then?" And you know, I was just laughing at that and saying, "Yeah, I guess, you know, I'd never thought of it that way. Yeah, she was a single mom for all those years. She was raising her kid alone." But you know, in raising my son as a single mom, I was exhausted, and I would just say, "Yeah, just watch anything on television. That's fine," you know. And but one of the benefits, or you know, one of the things of being, you know, a poorly paid journalism professor, was that I was in smaller homes, right? And so I could always hear what he was watching. I could kind of watch the television or look at the games that he was playing, and I would ask him like, "Oh, what's going on here? Why is this kid looking so mad? Like, what's with the sword?" And you know, all of that. And keep that conversation alive. And kids really want to talk about it. They want to tell you. Like, so he would tell me, "Oh, this is Grand Theft Auto. You are not going to like this," you know. And that was later, but earlier it was like Yu-Gi-Oh and you know, all these things. And so I'm kind of talking to him about it, and you know, having these conversations, and then letting him be, because you know, as you said, like, we are not going to be able to monitor their online use. We're not going to be keeping a track of anything. These kids really do know. And now look at us all, right? Like Zoom, and like Jamie's son was pulling at her arm, like all of that is happening around them. Screens are all around them, right? So I think so my son and I were recently talking about this too, about his childhood. And I said, that was the right thing, right? And he said, yeah, like, because I spot misogyny, and like I can laugh at those things and sort of move on, because I didn't feel judged. Like, you know, he could be watching something, or he could be in some sort of a video game that is insulting to women and sexualizes them, or even is violent toward them. He could watch, but he's bringing that that media literacy to watching that. And so then the conversations, then he'll come to me and he'll say, "Oh, have you watched the show?" Like he said about the show In Treatment with Uzo Aduba as the therapist. You know, she's a Black woman and everything. And so he's watching things that, with strong female leads, and not thinking it as like, "Oh, I'm like I should watch this or hide it, or my mom's going to be pleased if I tell her this." It's just like it's what he's doing. And he tells me about horrible misogynistic things on like Reddit and all these things that I'm not going to those sites, right? And sometimes I ask him, like, "Why are you even on this thing?" And he says, "Oh God, these guys are ridiculous and they make me laugh." And like, "Do you know what's going on with the incel movement or the men's rights movement? Mama, you should know this." And like, send me a link. And so we have these conversations around these things. So I mean, part of it was trusting him. Like, you give them the lenses, you give them the values, and say, "Look, these are my values." As with any parenting, right? You give them a sense of values, you give them a sense of tradition, and then let them be, and they will come back to it if they think there was safety and love in it, right? And so because there was a lack of judgment, I think my son feels like he can tell me about anything, and I'll say "ew" or "wow, that sounds amazing."
Yeah, in in that developing that relationship and talking through things, in that chapter, you mentioned the platform Twitch, in which I had heard about, but I really didn't know anything about, in which you can watch other people playing video games. And this is and then in a venue where a lot of misogynistic comments may come up, or if the players discover a viewer is female, they might try to harass her or kick her out. And then in that chapter, you talk about how, with the proper framing and lenses and having the confidence to speak about these things, one can become an ally and speak up. And so, once the child is old enough, right, to be an ally in that kind of platform is, a powerful thing to think about, So I appreciate how you talk about having that channel of discussion open so that they can then tell you about all of the things that you can't possibly keep up with as they're growing and as the world moves on. And I want, go ahead.
Oh, I was saying, that's Dr. Kishona Gray who researches these things, right? And she said her two black kids navigating racial harassment and sexual and gendered harassment on Twitch and video games and things, and that she's teaching them to speak, or she overhears them again because she's played video games with them. She researches video games, and that she overhears them saying, hey, dude, cut it out, like that's not okay, That's all they need to say, and that they can have a voice there. And a lot of video game design feminists and women that I talk to in the video game industry have said that is definitely a space in which men can speak up, because it's also, you're not in a physical space, and that gives some anonymity, but it also gives that voice to young men where they can actually stand in solidarity, and that you see them do that, and it's lovely to see.
Mm-hmm. In a minute, if you have questions, please feel free to start typing them in. I was appreciative of the final chapter where you talk about, you reflect on, well, did I raise a feminist son? So reflecting on the things you've observed in Gibran and seeing how he moves through the world as an adult, and his beyonding your feminism in the ways that he notices, you had an interaction in a restaurant, and he pointed out, he couldn't, flirt with the waitress because the power relationship is imbalanced. So I love having that whole perspective, from those foundations of mythology all the way to seeing how Gibran has grown. Let's see. So we have one question so far. Please also feel free to hop in. Could you please repeat the name of the woman who researches video games and Twitch?
Yeah, it's Dr. Kishona Gray, Kishonna Gray, Gray. She's got some really terrific books and academic papers. She's an academic researcher. She's got some really good work that she's done.
Okay. Other questions? And Sonora, is there a question you wish I had asked?
No, I mean, I think maybe around like where we are as a culture. Jamie started out with this thing of the news coming from Texas, right? With the abortion, like pretty much a ban if you're doing 6 weeks,
Mm-hmm.
Just makes me think like sometimes, and all the things that the pandemic has laid bare, right? That women have had to step out of the workforce, and there's so much of domestic violence against women,
Mm-hmm.
and learning more about the lack of balance in house care, and caring for others like who are sick and everything. And then it feels like huge steps backward, right? Huge steps backward. So I think, sometimes there can be a sense of despair. And so, and I feel like, no, stay with the hope. I still keep meeting young men, especially, I've also heard from older men and men who are not fathers who found something in the book just as men, and that they feel moved by something, and they feel like, oh gosh, I wish I had been raised this way, but I can do better. All I can do is like or I can change things, or I can do better with other people's kids, or my own kids if I have them, etc. That's been very moving, and I think there's something that is happening in culture that's moving us to a change. So even in the despair of days like this one, where something horrible like this that comes out, and of course we must fight all those fights. We can't say, oh yeah, somewhere the world is changing, but I think we should keep track of the longer arc, right? That things are changing, and we meet young people every day. I think one possible question also is that, why would boys do this? Are we disadvantaging them in some way? And I don't think we are. I feel like my son has found his people. He's found other young men like him, right? His friends and women, that he's, and non-binary and other genders. And I think he's quite content with, the group that he has that has similar ideas. And it's not like some really like politically correct, boring world or anything. They're having a lot of fun, and they have irreverent humor, and they have all the the mistakes and all of life, and he's quite self-assured about his masculinity, and and of course, as I say in the book too, he still mansplains to me. Like every time we talk, he'll mansplain something, and it really is mansplaining, because I feel like, no, this thing I know, I know this, right? So we'll never really completely have the perfect feminist son.
Right, of course. And I think that speaks a little to, we have a couple of questions here. I think what you're saying speaks a little bit to this next question. I wonder if you could talk about teaching sons to create space for others while also building their confidence and self-worth.
Yeah, that's such a huge one, and it's so difficult, right? Because I mean, all of us want space. I mean, am I making enough spaces for other women, right? And so, so I think part of it is that just to be a good human being and seeing that there is enough to go around, right? First of all, we need to also be working for a world in which there's enough to go around for everyone, so that people of color are not jostling for something, that there's only one or two positions or one or two publications that will be given to BIPOC folks, and so everyone now compete for this, right? When you start to have equity and you start to say there's enough to go around, then people will lean into that idea that, okay, then I must make room, right? I think also the idea of making room is gentle to men, in the sense that, dude, you don't always have to be a leader. You don't have to always be right. You can ask questions, you can step aside, you can apologize, you can, that cut yourself some slack. You don't always have to be a leader or have the knowledge, right?
Yeah.
That itself is a way of stepping aside and passing the mic to someone else, passing the mic to women or other people, and saying that there's comfort, and you can take turns, or you can also step out and be a good follower,
Yeah. Listening. And I love that section also about the steps of an apology. Someone had researched into the steps of an apology. I appreciated reflecting on that. We have a couple of other questions. So do you have any thoughts on how gender is expressed these days versus when you were raising your son? I'm so careful to say my kid, despite the fact that my son feels almost certain to identify as male as he grows older. That section in the book intrigued me, as I feel like the idea of gender identity has shifted so much just in the past few years.
That is so true, right? That our understanding of the idea of gender identity has shifted so much, right? That maybe these identities were always around, and that we just had everyone conforming to something. And I wonder about this, right? Because my son was born in 1995. When I did got the ultrasound, and I write about that, right? When I went for the ultrasound, and they said, oh, it's going to be a boy, because they noticed a penis in the ultrasound, and of course we say, oh yeah, it's a boy, right? So it's assigned even before birth, and then of course we are buying the blue and whatever it is that we're doing, right? So that was that time, and I do feel like if I were to raise him again, I would do less of a gender binary kind of a thing and say you're a boy and all of that, and saying kid is fine. We can say that, and if someone says, oh, what do you mean kid, like is it a boy, do you have a son or a daughter, and that you can choose, and you can and also if you choose saying you're a son or you're a boy, but if later you find out that you identify more strongly as another gender, that is also fine, right? So families can decide how to navigate that, and I think there's something beautiful in that, because what is the ultimate aim? And I say this to friends and cousins, right? Be on the side of your kid, not on the side of society, right? And for me, that was really, really important, and I think part of it was because I was also breaking rules and stepping away from the norms myself. But in living a feminist life and making difficult feminist choices of walking away from a husband and money and security and safety and all the cultural things that I'd been told, it'll be terrifying to be a woman on your own. Yes, it was terrifying. But anyway, so making all those feminist choices also then lets me say, to my son that it's going to be okay. Like, I'm on your side, and no one's going to be able to convince me that you are a bad person, or that that you need to be rejected. I reject the world. I don't reject you.
Yeah. And then, yes, the next question was very similar. I think we touched that on laying the groundwork early for raising a feminist son, and keeping open the possibility of the gender fluidity. Yes. Thank you for that question. Please feel free to keep those questions coming. Yeah, we are very, in baby land, we have a steady stream of hand-me-downs, and we start to get thinking about, some of these outfits are very gendered. Are people gonna comment, if it says hunk on the front, and then if we go out on a walk with his little onesie that says hunk, is he going to get comments about that, and start socializing him in those ways. So it's there's all sorts of levels to it,
yeah, it is such a complex thing, isn't it? Like, you don't want to live like this intensely politically correct life,
right?
Where you're not making any choices at all, right? And you want to be able to make choices, but that's I think that's the thing, like telling your child that, look, this is the way I raised you, but I'm open to whatever, at an age where you are able to say something, I'm open to what you have to say, and also say that same thing to your friends, like these are the choices we are making, but I understand that these things are complex, and I understand that, yeah.
Yeah, I am so excited to have conversations with my son. Right now, it's more, and the thing about it is, maybe most parents have this, where you have these interactions from your first day of interaction, and you think, this baby knows stuff. There's a knowing look. He's just he's absorbing, and we have a lot of discussions when we go out for walks with our letter carrier, who always says, don't think your child can't understand. They are absorbing everything, and especially from 6 months, the language starts coming in, and so just, of course, you want to have, you don't want to overthink every interaction, of course, but thinking about those conversations can end up starting pretty early at the appropriate level. There's a comment. My son gets a lot of man shirts from a relative. We changed them to mango. It was fun. Yeah, that's super fun, for sure. I'm going to use that.
I love that. So cool. That is really fun. I mean, I think the man shade is also like trying to push them to have certain masculine or, you know, some older man characteristics, right? And that, I think that can be problematic at such a young age, especially, you know. Yeah. So I'd love to know more about you, Anca. Like, what, you know, what are some of the conversations that, like, I'm guessing, yeah, that the gender conversation is coming up, and what else is coming up for you? Are you enjoying? I mean, I know you're enjoying the babyhood, right?
Oh yes. You know, well, obviously very tired, but very, very much enjoying every day. You know, there's something new. You know, and you know, reading books to Damien, and dance parties with him, and like he's getting really ready to. He hates lying down, right? So any moment where like I can help him walk, and you know he's not walking yet, but I appreciated that chapter when you talk about parents comparing the development of their children, and you know my son isn't walking at 8 months, and my peers are saying their children have been walking at 7 months. So these ideas of like the baby's strength, I've been thinking about that. That seems to come up. It's interesting. But he loves Goodnight Moon. So that's, you know, that's like the nighttime ritual. We have Goodnight Moon, and we definitely think about race. You know, we're a transracial family, so thinking about having, you know, all, you know, obviously all children need diversity in their books, but like we want to have books that have, you know, families that don't look alike, families that do look alike, and then yes, of course, gender, and you had mentioned also in the fairy tale chapter, karate tales. Is that, yeah? So the folk tales about animals. So I mean, I think, you know, it's so interesting with children. A friend of mine said that like new parents they become like zoologists. Like you start to talk about. You become an expert in animals. We're just drawn to that aspect. Yeah.
It is so true. I remember when I was pregnant and in Bangalore in India, and some people had visited and they said they wanted to go to the zoo in Bangalore, and I said, "Why the zoo? That's disgusting. Like I don't like those animals." And there's like, "Oh, disgusting." And then you know, 2 years later, I'm like, zoo, like, you know, and I'm loving it, right? Because I'm like, zebra, look at the zebra. You know, just like and saying like, wow, I didn't know spiders have 8 legs. How did I miss that? Like, you know, it's sort of a period of rediscovery, right? Rediscovering so much and delighting, like a second childhood, delighting in that. And you raised this thing of race as well. I think too about that, like about how in the US I had to become, and I'm sure for you too, like now you're you know, as a transracial family, you're going to have to relook at your own country, just like we became zoologists. We all have to become, you know, scholars now, and because America is going to be like, you know, surfacing in that, you know, that those conversations will surface as well. And you know, for me, bringing my child from India to the US and raising him here, like thinking that, oh, I've rescued him from like this Brahminical patriarchy and blah, 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 but then seeing how patriarchy shows up here and how you know, a certain kind of masculinity seizes him here, and how America sees him as a brown-skinned male, you know. So all of that becomes really profound, especially as they turn into young men, because, you know, at the age of 17, suddenly he's being seen as a threat, and the cute baby that everyone said, oh, what a cutie, suddenly becomes, oh, you know, like this is a man of color. So I learned a lot about America. So you definitely learn about animals in the zoo, and then eventually we start to learn a lot about our countries, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so in the preparing to adopt, in the process, when you say you're open to transracial adoption, you know, there's another layer of education that you're thankfully required to do. Is like 4 hours in our instance. And one of the things we did was we participated in a webinar about having the conversation with your Black child about the dangers, you know, interacting with the police. And one of the things that comes up in that discussion, and that came up in other discussions with other adoptive parents that have now have older children, is that conversation ends up happening a lot earlier than you would like it to happen. You know, as a parent, because you want to protect your son, of course, you want to protect your children. So thinking about, you know, with my, you know, we have a baby right now, but I'm very much aware now as we move, you know, just around the city, just walking around, being prepared for comments, being a very visible family. So, you know, one thing that our social worker told us to do is just have a positive educational sort of default response, so that, you know, you're protecting your child, right? You don't know what someone is going to say, but you can have that sort of that positive educational stance, right? So it kind of connects back to what you were saying earlier about having that hope. And are you still there, Sonora? Because I lost your image.
Oh, I'm still here. I wonder if people can see me. I hope they can. Oh, can you see me?
I can hear you, but I can't see you.
Oh, okay. I don't know. Can anyone in the audience see me? If you could write in the chat. Okay.
I was just going to comment. It does look like the connection is getting a little. The connection's getting a little frayed, which
okay.
We are almost to the 8 o'clock hours, or the hour. So I really appreciate both of you in this conversation. Anca, we talked briefly before this started. I've been part of a race conscious parenting group, and they talk about how talking about race at an age appropriate level should start when they're like 3. But for a lot of white families, that doesn't happen. So I think that it's an important thing that we should all be thinking about. And also, I typed into the comments and I didn't hit enter, but I really wanted to. What you said, Sonora, about being on the side of your kid. I think that if you are on the side of your kid, you are a good parent, you are going to be raising a feminist, whatever gender they are. So I really appreciate both of you for being here tonight. I appreciate all of the people in the audience tonight, and good night wherever you are. And thank you again so very, very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Anca. This is so lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you.